The offside crisis of 1925. Before we dive into the WM, we need to understand the problem it solved. Prior to 1925, the offside rule required 3 players between an attacker and the goal. This meant teams could pack their defenses, and football became frustratingly stagnant. Goals were rare, matches were boring, and something had to change. The Football Association decided to reduce the offside requirement from 3 players to 2. Suddenly, attackers had freedom they'd never experienced before. Strikers were running riot, defenses were in shambles, and goal tallies exploded overnight. In the first season after the rule change, the English First Division saw a 43% increase in goals scored. It was absolute chaos, and coaches were desperate for a solution. Chapman's masterstroke at Arsenal. Enter Herbert Chapman, the tactical genius managing Arsenal. While other managers were panicking, Chapman saw opportunity. He looked at the traditional 2-3-5 formation that every team used and realized it was now obsolete. With only 2 defenders, teams were getting slaughtered by the new offside rule. Chapman's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He pulled back the center half from midfield to create a third defender, forming what would become the backbone of the WM formation. This center back would act as a stopper, positioned between the 2 fullbacks to deal with the central striker. It was revolutionary because it sacrificed attacking numbers for defensive stability at a time when everyone else was still trying to outscore their problems. But Chapman didn't stop there. He recognized that pulling a midfielder back would leave a gap in the middle of the park, so he dropped 2 of his inside forwards deeper to create a new midfield structure. When you mapped it out on the pitch, the formation created 2 distinct shapes. 3 forwards and 2 inside forwards formed a W, while the 3 defenders and 2 wing-halves formed an M. The WM was born, the genius of positional roles. What made the WM truly revolutionary wasn't just the shape, it was how Chapman defined each position's role. The center back became purely defensive, a destroyer whose job was to mark the opposition's main striker out of the game. The fullbacks had clear responsibilities. Mark the opposing wingers and don't venture forward unless absolutely necessary. The wing-halves became the engine room of the team. These weren't just midfielders, they were box-to-box players before the term even existed. They had to defend when needed, support attacks when possible, and most importantly, link the defense to the forwards. Players like Wilf Copping and Jack Crayston excelled in these roles at Arsenal, covering every blade of grass during matches. The inside forwards were perhaps the most interesting evolution. These players operated in the space between midfield and attack, creating chances, scoring goals, and tracking back to help defensively. They were the creative heartbeat of the team, similar to what we'd now call attacking midfielders or number 10s. Alex James epitomized this role at Arsenal, dictating play with his vision and passing ability. The 3 forwards maintained width and attacking threat. The center forward was the target man, while the 2 wingers provided pace and crossing ability. This attacking trident created the W shape that gave the formation half its name. Arsenal's dominance and the spread. The results were immediate and devastating for Arsenal's opponents. Chapman's side won the First Division title in 1931, then again in 1933 and 1934. They also lifted the FA Cup in 1930. The WM formation didn't just work, it dominated English football throughout the 1930s. Other teams had no choice but to adapt or die. The WM spread across England like wildfire, then jumped to Europe and South America. By the mid-1930s, it had become the default formation in world football. Managers everywhere were trying to replicate Chapman's success, often copying the formation without fully understanding its nuances. What's remarkable is how quickly the WM became orthodoxy. Within a decade of its invention, nearly every professional team in the world was using some variation of it. That's unprecedented in football history. Even the most revolutionary modern tactics take longer to gain universal acceptance. Tactical flexibility within structure. One aspect that often gets overlooked is how flexible the WM actually was. While the basic shape remained consistent, different teams interpreted it differently. Some managers pushed their wing-halves higher, creating a more attacking version. Others dropped them deeper for additional defensive security. The Italian teams, for example, adapted the WM to fit their naturally defensive philosophy. They emphasized the stopper center-back role even more, creating what would eventually evolve into catenaccio. Meanwhile, South American teams used the WM as a platform for more creative, expressive football, giving their inside forwards greater freedom to roam and create. This adaptability is part of why the WM lasted so long. It wasn't a rigid system, It was a framework that coaches could modify based on their players' strengths and their opponents' weaknesses. Teams could shift between defensive solidity and attacking ambition without changing their basic structure. The players who defined it. Certain players became synonymous with the WM formation. Their careers intertwined with its success. At Arsenal, Alex James was the conductor, a diminutive Scottish genius who orchestrated attacks from his inside forward position. His partnership with Cliff Baston on the left wing was legendary, combining James's creativity with Baston's clinical finishing. Ted Drake exemplified the center-forward role in the WM. Strong, powerful, and clinical, he scored 42 goals in 41 games during the 1934-35 season. He was the spearhead of Arsenal's attack, the focal point that everything revolved around. His movement created space for the inside forwards, while his finishing converted their creativity into goals. Defensively, Herbie Roberts pioneered the stopper center-back role. Before Chapman converted him from a halfback to a center-back, the position didn't really exist in its modern form. Roberts became the prototype for generations of central defenders, showing that a purely defensive midfielder could be just as valuable as creative players. International success and World Cup impact. The WM formation's influence extended beyond club football. The 1934 World Cup, held in Italy, saw multiple teams employing variations of Chapman's system. Italy's victory that year was built on a solid WM foundation, with their coach Vittorio Pozzo adapting the formation to suit Italian football culture. England's national team adopted the WM naturally, given its dominance in English football. During the 1930s and 1940s, England remained largely unbeaten at home, their WM setup proving too sophisticated for visiting nations. The formation gave English football an identity, a tactical framework that defined how the game should be played. However, this dominance also bred complacency. English football became so wedded to the WM that it struggled to evolve when new tactical innovations emerged in the 1950s. The famous 6-3 defeat to Hungary in 1953 exposed the WM's limitations against more fluid, modern systems. The beginning of the end. By the early 1950s, cracks were appearing in the WM's armor. The Hungarian national team, with their revolutionary tactics, showed that rigid positional play could be exploited by fluid movement and interchanging positions. Ferenc Puskás and his teammates didn't respect the WM structure. They moved between lines, dragged defenders out of position, and created chaos. The Brazilians were also experimenting with different approaches. Their 1958 World Cup victory showcased a more flexible 4-2-4 formation that would eventually evolve into the 4-3-3 and 4-4-2 systems that dominated the latter half of the 20th century. These formations offered better defensive coverage and more midfield control than the WM as coaches began to realize that football had evolved beyond what the WM could offer. The game was faster, players were fitter, and the tactical demands were more complex. The WM's rigid structure, once its greatest strength, became a liability in this new era. The lasting legacy. Despite falling out of fashion by the 1960s, the WM formation's influence never truly disappeared. It established principles that remain fundamental to modern football: the importance of a dedicated defensive midfielder, the concept of inside forwards operating between lines, and the idea that formations should be designed to solve specific tactical problems. When you watch modern football, you can still see echoes of the WM. The defensive midfielder sitting in front of the back four? That's the stopper center-back moved forward. The attacking midfielders operating in the half spaces? Those are inside forwards by another name. The emphasis on width through wingers? Direct inheritance from Chapman's system. The WM also established the idea that tactics matter. Before Chapman, formations were largely traditional and unchanging. After the WM's success, every coach understood that tactical innovation could provide a competitive edge. It opened the door for future tactical revolutions from total football to gegenpressing. Why it mattered. The WM formation represented more than just a clever solution to a rule change. It proved that football was a thinking person's game, that strategy and organization could triumph over individual talent. Chapman showed that a coach could be as important as the players, that tactical preparation could win titles. For 30 years, the WM was the dominant force in world football. That's an extraordinary achievement when you consider how quickly modern tactics become obsolete. It shaped how generations of players understood the game, how coaches approached tactical problems, and how fans viewed football itself. Even today, when we discuss formations, we're using a language that the WM helped create. The idea of distinct lines, defense, midfield, attack, comes from this era. The notion that each position has specific duties and responsibilities, that's WM thinking. The WM formation was truly the tactical blueprint of a century, not because it lasted 100 years, but because its influence shaped the 100 years that followed. From Chapman's arsenal to modern football, the ghost of the WM haunts every tactical innovation, reminding us that sometimes the old ideas are the ones that change everything.